right, kick things off. All right, thank you, RVAsec. I appreciate you being here and helping me get this technology working. I'm really excited to be here today. A number of years ago, I worked in a university as an information security officer, a university much like this one. And at that university, I was involved in handling data breaches. We had to notify thousands of people about the breaches, dealt with people responding to phishing attacks, including one individual who responded to a phishing attack on a Monday. One of my staff members called him up to let him know and explain what phishing is, and he said he wouldn't do that again. 2 days later, the same individual responded to a phishing attack, and in his account was sending out all kinds of spam. So I called him up and asked him, did you respond to a phishing attack on Monday and Wednesday? And he said, no. So I thought about it, and I asked him in a different way, and I asked him, did you receive an email from our IT department on Monday and Wednesday and respond with your password? And he said, yes. So that kind of sets the groundwork for my talk to tell you about how hard information security is and how sometimes we do things wrong. Okay. So the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and getting and expecting different results. And I actually believe that's the definition of information security. All right. So I believe we're doing it wrong. Getting a little ahead of myself. So we treat information security sometimes as Boolean. We really should be focusing on the risk, but often we're focusing on the vulnerabilities. We think about things in terms of worst case scenarios when the worst case scenario is not really what's likely to happen. And often we serve as an obstacle, getting in the way of the business trying to achieve its objectives. And though we sometimes do demonstrate value, we have a hard time articulating it and demonstrating it. And then we point fingers at each other. And this is reinforced by the conversations we have in the echo chamber when we talk to each other in the information security community. We need to get outside of the echo chamber. I think I'm just going to put this down. Do it the old-fashioned way. Okay. So when I say we're doing it wrong, I'm saying that to be nice. If I said you, it would probably be a little bit rude. I'm including myself in we. So I did some research, and in the research I found, when I say we, what I really mean is the vast majority of this, it's really hard to see, but basically the vast majority of us are doing it wrong all the time. Some of us are doing it wrong some of the time. A very small percentage of us are actually doing it right. And I want to meet those because I haven't met many of those people. And the second smallest sliver is the people that are delusional. They think that they're doing right, but they're not doing information security right. But it's just not the information security field that's to blame. If you look at this chart, it's sort of a maturity level for the information security program in an organization. Is that legible? Okay, so at the bottom, that's the least mature organization. That's one that points fingers and says, don't let this happen again. The organization at the top is the one that wants to know how you can help them achieve business objectives. And they're trying to work with you from a governance perspective to find out how you can help them by telling you what is important to them and allowing you to have the autonomy and control to address risk that meets their needs. All right, so who am I? So I'm not a rock star, not a guru, and I am not a thought leader. And so this is another person in the information security community, Chris Ng. I'm not actually calling him out. He actually has a really cool video that talks about information security thought leaders. I recommend you check it out. It's in the footer. All right, so here's the rules for the talk today. Hold any questions to the end because I have a lot to go through. It's okay to laugh. Information security is a really difficult, challenging field. If you keep everything bottled up, you're going to go insane. And if you want to put some feedback on Twitter, whether it's positive or negative, I'd like to see your feedback. Okay, so I have to give a disclaimer. And so I want to tell you these are not necessarily the views of my employer or anyone else in this room, and they may not even be my views come tomorrow. If you have feelings that are going to be hurt if I'm going to tell you you're doing something wrong, this is your opportunity to leave. And I have the right to change this disclaimer at any point. and it applies retroactively back until 1970, January 1st. Okay. All right, so let's get into some bad advice. Does anyone know what this is? The Cinnamon Challenge, right? So she's about to do the Cinnamon Challenge, and I don't know why she would want to do this. Let's say she's doing it because she was told that it would prevent the accumulation of cellulite and it would keep the zombies away when the zombie apocalypse comes. So 2 seconds after she's about to put this in her mouth, this is what she looks like. It's kind of hard to tell, but basically you shouldn't put a spoonful of cinnamon in your mouth. So whoever told her to do that was giving her really bad advice. So we give really bad advice in our field too. So let's talk about the typical password policy. We tell people, create unique passwords, memorize them, and change them regularly. Okay. That's a really bad thing to do. It doesn't actually work, and we've been doing this for years, so why are we doing that? Well, let me tell you why it's bad, first of all. It's not actually what we want, right? We don't really care if they memorize them, we just care if they keep them secure. We are just leading them to believe the only way to do that is to memorize them. That worked good when they only had one password, but when they have accounts on 30 different sites, it doesn't really scale that well. Then we want to have them change them regularly. Why? There's no research actually supports that provides value. In fact, research indicates that by forcing them to change the passwords regularly, they do stupid things like sequence the passwords, or even if they're not sequencing them, they may follow certain formats like spring, summer, fall, or colors, or names of cars, or sports teams. And so if you get access to one of their passwords, you potentially have good information that allows you to determine what their other subsequent passwords will be. Okay, so I have some rules to share. Make it difficult, and they will find a workaround and challenge the status quo. The status quo says, do those things from a password policy perspective, despite the fact we know that it doesn't work. And I'm asking you to look at things a different way and consider whether there may be a better solution. Okay. So sometimes we do things that have unintended consequences. So back to the password policy. We want them to memorize them, so sometimes they enter the password for site A and site B because they don't know which one they memorize and which one it goes to. So we're trusting that the password to your organization is not being entered into a site that's collecting it, so they would potentially use it to target your site and your organization. To me, that's not a very good thing. The users ignore requirements and don't make them unique. We tell them they have to be unique, but they can't, so they don't make them unique. They don't write them down securely. We tell them they have to memorize them, but they're not going to do that, so they write them down, they do it insecurely. We could be telling them to write them down securely, to put them in their wallet where they keep their credit cards, which they're pretty comfortable securing in their wallet. We tell them to create unique passwords, but again, it gives clues to the passwords they use because they're not truly unique. And the sequencing piece, they sequence the passwords with numbers, years, and other sequences, so it's easy to determine one password from what the previous one was. So we probably should create practical and palatable solutions. This is not a practical way to solve the password problem. And we should focus on outcomes. It's one thing to say, well, this is what you're required to do. If they're not actually doing it, we're making a mistake, and we need to try a different way. That way may not work either, but if you keep continuing the same way that doesn't work and expect different results, you're not going to get different results. Okay, so let's move on to policy. So a lot of organizations write policies. It's basically a CYA. You have to have a really long policy that covers everything under the sun. But ultimately what that means is law is happy. You may be a little bit happy, but the users aren't happy. They can't read it. They look at it and see it's 10 pages long and just choose not to read it because it's so long. Even if they do read it, they probably don't understand it. It's unlikely they're actually going to remember what's in there that you wanted them to know. Okay. So I'm not saying you shouldn't have policy. You absolutely need to have it. But consider potentially having a condensed version of the policy that they may actually read, so they'll actually retain the 3 or 4 things you want them to know. Okay. So build relationships and establish credibility. One thing you can do is actually talk to your users to find out, what do you think about our policy? Have you read it? Do you understand it? Is it resonating with you? How do you recommend we could potentially change our policy so you'd actually read it and understand it and follow it? Seems like a pretty simple solution, but my guess is many organizations aren't doing that. Curious, are any of you doing that? Are any of you reaching out, not to your stakeholders like law or corporate audit, but to end users get input about your password policies or other IT security policies? Let's show of hands, is anyone doing that? Well, that's actually encouraging. I was expecting 0 hands. To see 1 hand, that's very encouraging. It's a start. Okay. So let's get into broken paradigms. At one point, people thought the world was flat or cube-shaped. Well, obviously, we now know that's not the case. For a long time, we focused on these 4 controls: passwords, firewalls, operating system patching, and antivirus. I'm going to get back to this later in the presentation, but I challenge you to think about this before we get to it later in the conversation. What if I told you you couldn't implement any of those 4 controls? You think you might be able to come up with some other controls that may provide equivalent value? Think about it. We're going to talk about it later. Okay, so we have a model we all like to talk about, CIA, and then we mostly focus on C because it's important to keep our confidential data safe. Well, I think it's a mistake that it's called CIA. I think it should be called AIC, and not just because I like the band Alice in Chains. Because I think to most organizations, most organizations really care more about availability than they do confidentiality. Not to say they don't have systems with sensitive data that they want to protect. Sure they do. But if you look at the holistic view of the entire organization, I believe most organizations care more about keeping their systems up and running. And they may not know it, but I also believe they actually care more about integrity. For example, if you have a manufacturing facility and the chemicals used to make the product and the temperatures used to bake the product are modified slightly, you may make something that looks good, and you may put it out in the market, and you may find out that the product doesn't work as expected, doesn't last as long, and now you have a big multi-million-dollar recall. That may be more important than the machine shutting down for an hour a month. The organization's not always thinking about these kinds of things. So there are some other models. One's the Parkerian hexad. It takes the CIA and adds into it the concept of possession, which essentially means it's like confidentiality, but let's say this is something that's encrypted, it has data in it, and you get a hold of it. You have possession of it, but unless you have the keys, you don't actually have a compromise of the confidentiality. So that's what possession is. Authenticity means that if I sent this to one of you in the back, you catch it, and you want to know if it's from me, that's what authenticity means. And availability, that's probably not what I meant to have. Just ignore that one. So anyway, I figured if this Parker guy could come up with his own term and come up with the Parkerian hexad, then me, Steve Werby, could come up with the Werbian quintet. It's the first time saying it out loud. It sounds really good. So thanks. So I looked at this conceptually, and this is what I believe organizations think about in order. I think they care about the utility of the control, and that's the one thing I missed was the utility of it. If you encrypt something, but you can't decrypt it, that's not very good utility. So it's a concept of utility. It means that the security control actually works the way you expect it to. So I think utility and availability are most important to organizations. I'm not saying it's always the case. Integrity, I believe, is next in line. And I think confidentiality and possession, which I lump together, and authenticity are what the organizations care about at the bottom. Okay. So if you walk around and talk to your stakeholders, you may find that if that's what's important to them, you may have a better opportunity to align with your business needs. If you've been living your entire life thinking they care about confidentiality and they care about integrity, you have the opportunity to change your approach to security. Okay. We're also a very vulnerability-centric field. I'll give you a couple examples that are not information security related. Let's say you had an unlocked 20-year-old vehicle. It's beaten up and it's in a parking lot with lots of other nice cars. It's unlocked, so that's a vulnerability, right? Okay. Are there threats? Sure there's threats. There are people that walk around parking lots all the time looking for unlocked cars or cars that are locked with stuff laying around so they can break the window or open the door, take the laptops and things that are laying around. They're also looking for nice cars they can drive away. If you have a 20-year piece of S vehicle and it's unlocked and empty, there is a threat, but there really isn't an impact. So I think it's perfectly fine to leave your car unlocked if that's what your car is. So to take things to the different end of the spectrum, if you have an unlocked house with $10 million in diamonds sitting on the kitchen table, it's in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and no one knows it's there and it's 1,500 miles from everything else, and the house is unlocked, no one's there, that's a vulnerability. And there's an impact because if someone magically found their way to this house, they would probably steal those diamonds if they thought they could get away with it. Well, there is no threat. And I say no, I said earlier that things aren't Boolean. When I say no, I really mean very close to zero threat. The likelihood that there's a threat actor that is going to find out about your house with the diamonds in it or randomly show up 1,500 miles in the Sahara Desert is very low. So this is probably one of the most important set of takeaways I want you to leave today with. A vulnerability without an impact is not a risk. A vulnerability without a threat is not a risk. If you think about those things throughout your day as you're working on information security, you may find that a lot of what you're looking at that you're concerned about isn't really a concern to anyone in the organization and should not be a concern to you. So there's a lot of definitions of what information security is. Here's a pretty standard one. Information security is the practice of defending information against unauthorized access, use, disclosure, modification, or destruction. Boy, that's a lot for me to memorize, so I don't really like it. I came up with my own definition, not that this is all that novel. Information security is the defense of information in IT systems in alignment with stakeholder direction for addressing risk and opportunity. Ignore the disclosure and modification, all that. I really don't care. I just want to defend information in IT systems against stuff that's bad. And so what I need to know is, what kind of information do we have? What IT systems is that information in? I need direction from stakeholders in terms of the importance of that information in the IT systems to their business processes and their goals. And then I need help with assessing what the risk is and what the risk appetite is. And here's an important piece too, opportunity. It's really the risk, like a risk, which a risk might be the risk of something bad happening. Opportunity is really the risk of something good not happening. So it's kind of the opposite. So one example might be that your organization wants to roll out a completely new service, and to do it they need mobile apps and a mobile workforce, and you're security and you say, no, we can't have that because that's insecure. Well, you know, if that's what the stakeholders and shareholders are expecting and that's the way they're going to increase their dividend and have everyone keep their jobs, that's an opportunity that you're saying no to. And you might be saying no to an opportunity that they view as hundreds of millions of dollars in opportunity. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be the one that's saying no to that $100 million opportunity, at least without having some context to it. Well, actually, I don't want to be the one saying no, period. What I want to be doing is saying, here's what the risk is, here's what your options are, look at the menu, and what do you want to eat? Okay, so how do we get from the chaos state we're in? Well, I don't want to get from chaos to disorder. Somebody must have come in and compromised my PowerPoint presentation because that really should say chaos to order. I think it's because I connected my thumb drive to somebody else's computer earlier. I'll be talking with them later. Okay, so an organization has a mission and a vision, goals and success factors. Those are important to know. Those drive the business processes that are essential or non-essential. And then that tells you what information is important and what IT systems that information's in that supports those business processes. And from there, you can go through exercise to determine risks and opportunities. Seems like a lot to do, and you can gather some of it from a business impact assessment or IT system inventory with additional attributes. But you don't really have to start at the top. That's ideal, but you know, everything's ideal. Ideal is everyone can memorize 100 passwords, but that's not real. So you could always jump down to phase 3 and start there. You don't have to boil the ocean. You don't have to start with the entire enterprise. You just have to start somewhere. Maybe start with your sales organization or HR, or somebody that you have a rapport with, and ask them what IT systems they have that are important, what information they have that's important, and how that impacts their business processes. Maybe that's only 1% of your organization, but it's a start. You're demonstrating that you are developing a process and a governance that allows you to replicate that throughout the organization, and word may spread, assuming you do it well. So start simple and enhance later. And let's talk about risk. Here's a couple of formulas for risk. I really don't like them, especially the notion that you can multiply arbitrary threat numbers by arbitrary vulnerability and impact numbers. I do agree that risk is a function of threat, vulnerabilities, and impact, but I don't think you can come up with any kind of formula that multiplies them together or squares them or does anything like that and have it make any kind of sense. So let's not worry really about the numbers, but the reality is risk is the likelihood of having an impact. And you can have a range of impacts. If you have a database of 100 million records, one of them can get stolen, 10,000 get stolen, 100 million of them can get stolen. They could end up published on the web. Someone could do nothing with it. There's an entire range of things that could happen. So if you took the likelihoods and impacts and put them on a grid, you would have some on the top right that are the risks that are the most impactful and the most likely to occur, and the bottom left are the ones that are the least likely to occur and the least impactful. Now, How far along that you set your green, yellow, and red lines really depends on risk appetite. But the gist of it is red things are things that you probably want to address pretty quickly if you can afford to do so. Yellow are things you want to get to eventually, or at least monitor because they might eventually become red. And green are things that you probably can live with because you can't do everything. Does anyone here have all the resources they need to do their job? All right, someone else asked that in a different presentation. I think we have the same group here, so none of us do. So let's talk about risk appetite. So risk appetite is how much risk are you willing to consume? So most people eat hamburger with one piece of meat on it. This is actually a coworker of my wife's when we were living in Texas. And he did the 12 by 12 challenge, which is 12 pieces of meat and 12 pieces of cheese. And he finished that thing. It took him 2 hours, but he finished it. So his appetite for the risk of cholesterol and calories was pretty high. Right? Okay. So how do we calculate risk appetite? Do we have a really cool formula we can use? Sorry, I don't have the magic bullet answer, but I can talk to you about ways that you can arrive at a risk appetite. So things you can do is, like I said, just put things on the grid. It's simple, it's pretty defensible, and then talk about the likelihood and impact and start from the top right, and you'll eventually arrive at the things that the organization can tolerate and the things that they can't tolerate. They can also be pretty descriptive, such as you could reach out to manufacturing and they might say, we need to have 99.9% uptime. That is our requirement. We need you to secure our systems so that we achieve that uptime. All right, well, if that's the case, then availability is what they're telling you is important, and there's things you can do to try to achieve that. They might also say, because they've heard of large enterprises having their social media accounts compromised and it's very embarrassing, we do not want that to happen. Well, if you don't want that to happen, there's controls you can put in place that reduce the risk of it happening. But if you wait for it to happen, then you're going to scramble and someone's going to say, how did you let this happen? It's a good idea to think about these kinds of scenarios and look at what the risk is and talk to your stakeholders about them. In a lot of organizations, no audit findings is pretty important. That's perfectly legit. I've worked in some of those organizations. They have no issue with it, and it drives a lot of security. You can also put things in dollar terms. That's really hard to do unless you have really good actuarial data about the likelihood of something, the potential dollar cost. But you can make up numbers and arrive at some averages and everyone will be happy. Unfortunately, these risk appetites are going to vary across the organization. Research and development may want to protect their confidential data more than marketing does, and you may have a different tolerance for PII than you do IP. I would say most organizations are probably less concerned about social security numbers than they are about their intellectual property. They lose their intellectual property, they might have new competitors who go out of business. They lose their PII. It's embarrassing. They do the data breach notification, life goes on. Been there, done that, got the shirt. All right, so in risk appetite, you might say, but I don't have the access to people to talk to about risk appetite. Well, let's start within your own group. Talk to your peers in information security. You're not going to arrive at a very good answer, but it's better than doing nothing. Then you can move on to others within IT leadership or those in IT that work with the lines of business a little bit closer to the end customer and can help you figure out what risk is. You can talk to others who have insights like corporate audit, law. There are other people in your organization that have some concept of risk. You might even have a risk office or a CFO, and they probably have some idea of what risk is and can articulate things in a way that's meaningful to you. And then where we all want to get is to have a risk steering community or have access to the enterprise leadership team or the board. That happens in some orgs, not every org. I would not recommend trying to make that happen as a start. I'd start somewhere closer to the top. But if you do these things, eventually you'll get to the point where people are thinking about risk appetite and realizing that it's not your role as an information security practitioner to tell them what risk appetite is. It's your role to tell them what risk is and how it compares to their appetite. So don't let anyone pigeonhole you into having the role of deciding what the risk appetite is. Now, if you come to them with a blank sheet of paper and say, tell me the risk appetite, they're probably going to have eyes glazed over and not get very far. So it's not a bad idea to have a starting point and say, I don't really understand your business at all, but here's what I think the risk appetite is given the mental model I went through. And they might look at it and say, yeah, well, that one makes sense, but this one's totally off. But at least you give them a starting point and you make them the owner of risk appetite. Okay, so take advantage of opportunities. When you're talking to anyone within the business, find out what the risk appetite is. This doesn't have to be formal. It can just be a conversation, and you can always throw out the information they give. You don't have to take it at face value. Okay, so how do we look at risk? Here's a model that I adapted. All I really did was change some of the terminology. borrowed it right from the OWASP top 10 from 2013. But I like this model because talking with people that don't understand information security, it's pretty easy for them to understand these terms. You have a threat actor that does some kind of attack using some kind of method to exploit a vulnerability, right? And you have some controls in place, and the controls may allow that vulnerability not be exploited, or they may not be effective. And then that causes a technical impact, gives them access to a server. Access to a server the business doesn't care about that. Why would they care about that? They care about whether it affects their business processes or whether they gain access to information. So access to the server alone, that's a technical impact. Sometimes technical impacts translate into business impacts. So you can walk through this, and I've found 99% of the time, stakeholders understand this when you're not talking about malware and CNC and things that they don't understand and don't really need to. Unfortunately, walking through it from left to right, I find, is not a very good, it's a good way of describing it, but it's not a good way of actually identifying risk. So I have a different approach that I like to take. But before I take it, let's come back to an earlier concept, likelihood versus impact. If you have an impact that is extremely unlikely in its acceptable organization, it doesn't matter what your threats are. So if you work from right to left and you have an impact, and the impact is that a website that we have for an advertising campaign gets compromised and defaced, and the org says, we don't care because we'll just replace it in an hour, don't even go through this exercise. Why bother? You're just wasting your time, right? They've told you the impact doesn't matter to them. Why bother you're spending time talking about vulnerabilities and threats? On the flip side, if you have a type of threat actor, let's say an activist or hacktivist, that you're absolutely certain is never going to materialize in your environment, then don't even work from left to right with that threat actor. And you don't have to get very granular. Keep things really simple. Your threat actors could be activists, internal employees, your suppliers/vendors, cyber criminals. You don't have to really get more detail than that. Over time, you'll get more mature with it. Okay. Now, one thing this model doesn't do, it doesn't consider the concept of adjacency. So you may have a system that no one really cares about, but the local credentials are stored on it and they're easy to access. So someone gains access to those credentials and now they can get into a system that's more important. Or that system, System A, has direct access to System B, which is the one you really care about. So as you grow your maturity, you really need to take into account the concept of adjacency. Okay, so here's how I like to iterate. It's actually 3 steps. 1, I start with the impact. Then I jump all the way over to the left of the threat actor to see if there are any. Then I look at the vulnerabilities that the threat actor might try to exploit. What vulnerabilities are there? I'm not even worrying about the attack vector at this point. And what controls do we have? And after I think about that, I start thinking about the attack vector that that threat actor would use to exploit the vulnerability. And then, would they be able to bypass the controls, or are my controls sufficient? Okay, the next thing I do is look at the likelihood that threat actor would show up and the likelihood that they will target that particular vulnerability or set of vulnerabilities. And so CVSS has vulnerabilities rated 0 through 10, but it doesn't, those kind of concepts don't really take into account the prevalence of those kind of vulnerabilities and ability to discover them. If, for example, Java has a vulnerability, well, attackers know that Java is pretty much on every computer in the entire world, right? And it's pretty easy to discover if your machines are vulnerable to Java. So the combination of easy discovery and high prevalence makes that a vulnerability that attackers are more likely to try to exploit. And then also look at the likelihood that an attack vector is going to be used based on the skills and resources required. If it requires a $10,000 kit and 80 hours of time, and there's another vulnerability that requires freeware in 5 seconds, you might want to give precedence to prioritizing the one that's very easy to access and easy to use and low cost. So the last thing I do is I kind of throw this together in a mix and determine risk. And I don't have a magic formula, but it's very conceptual. Is there anyone in this room that walks through all these elements, not necessarily in that direction? Okay. So it probably seems fairly complex if you're not doing it, but if you start with models of things that are not security related, like your house and the safety of those in it and your possessions, I think you'll eventually pretty quickly get to the point where you're able to translate this to information security and do it well. So now we need to take the risks and compare them to risk appetite. Kind of move through some of this. This is pretty straightforward. So there's things you can do. The worst thing you really don't want to do is just ignore your risk. So if your organization's afraid of you turning over stones because you'll find risks underneath, you need to help them get to the point where they're comfortable with that, because ignoring a risk doesn't do anything to actually address the risk. And so there's a lot of things that you can actually do. But really what you want to do is overall define your current state, your current information security state, either for a particular system or type of information or the enterprise overall. And then where you want to be the future state and what the gaps are, because that's the language the organization understands. You're talking their language when you say, here's how we are, here's where we want to be, and here's the gaps, and here's the kind of progress that we're making. All right. So I'm going to get in some broken paradigms. So blinky lights. We all want to buy new stuff and stand up new stuff, especially from new vendors that we have no relationships with. Then we find out we can't manage it. It doesn't work well. You know, well, why are we doing that? I bet all of us have functionality that's not currently enabled or we haven't looked at in a while, and we can probably tune and make it run better. Get the stuff that you already have and make it run well. Get your maximum value out of it before you buy new tools or implement new free tools. Because if you're not using what you have well, what makes you think that the new thing you're going to get, you're going to actually implement well? You're not. I mean, it's not going to magically change. There's also a lot of information in your environment you can take advantage of. Lots of devices that do logging. They're not all even necessarily IT systems. For example, you may have HR systems that tell you somebody is out because of disciplinary action. Well, they're probably more likely to become a disgruntled employee that does something bad in your environment. You have people that leave. People that have already said, I'm leaving in 2 weeks, are much more likely to steal your data. Most of the data theft occurs after somebody announces their intentions to leave. Well, that information is not in an IT system. There's other information systems you can consume. Spend some time looking at those. It's not all electronic. You can get it from some paper records too and talking to people. All right. So now we need to compare our controls. How do we do that? How do we do that? How do we sit down with our stakeholders and look at 3 sets of controls and articulate why one might be better than another? So I have a model for some attributes that I like to consider, and I put these in order of how I think they're important to the organization. So one is, how confident are you and them in that alternative, right? They've never heard of it before, or they've heard that it's always been unsuccessful when it's been deployed elsewhere, or you don't think you can pull it off. Wow, that should carry some weight. Then think about the impacts we already talked about in terms of risks and opportunities. Then let's get into the concept of friction, user friction and management friction. So user friction is, does the control run in the background? Does it impact the user at all? Is it going to pop things up and disrupt their workflow? You're going to have to go through awareness and training so they understand what this new control is and so they can actually use it effectively. Because if you don't, they may do what they already do right now when they see an SSL error and just click through and ignore it. You don't want stuff that works good on paper but would have actually worked good in reality had you actually trained them and educated them, or at least talked to them beforehand to find out whether this would even work before you implemented it. Same thing with management friction. Do they have the political capital to help you pull this off? Are they willing to reallocate resources? And will it make them look good? Well, I'll say that again. Will it make them look good? Don't underestimate the importance of making them look good. In fact, sometimes you may want to do things that make them look good even though you don't think those are the right thing. It's all about relationship building and gaining credibility. Sometimes you have to go down that path to get what you want in the long run. So here's where I said I'd take us back to. Anyone want to take a stab at, can anyone think of a better way of doing this? Even just for one of these. Has anyone actually eliminated one of these 4 in your organization and replaced them with something else? Which I'm not arguing you do, but let's talk about it conceptually. All right. So passwords are designed to provide access via authentication. Firewalls, I'm not really sure what they're supposed to do except make everybody's life a miserable headache. We all have firewalls. If your organization's been around for any length of time and is any size organization, you probably have firewalls that were not implemented the way you wanted them to be, firewall rules that were implemented you didn't ask for, and probably no one can actually tell you what the heck the firewall rules that you have are actually doing. Well, maybe it's time to declare firewall bankruptcy. All right, so if you get on Twitter, that's a good one to say. Steve Werby declared firewall bankruptcy. Okay. Then OS patching. So I don't like OS patching. I mean, I think it's good. Let's all keep doing it. But look at what's actually exploited in the environment today. It is Java. No matter how you look at it, everything else added up besides Java is less exploited than Java. So I'm going to argue it'd be better to patch Java, not patch Java. It would be better to address Java, which may involve patching, and stop doing the OS patching than it would be to do the OS patching and not do anything else. Then antivirus, it just doesn't work. I mean, it's like you keep your doors locked at your house even though you know someone can kick them in or break your window. You just kind of do care. You do it because if you don't, people will go, hey, why are you the organization doesn't do antivirus? But let's not fool ourselves. It doesn't work. All right. You've seen some other talks probably talk about how easy it is to bypass. So conceptually, here's 4 ideas that I have. I'm not saying run out and do them, and don't attribute me that I'm saying that you should get rid of those other 4 controls, because that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying here's 4 controls that potentially provide the value to replace those other 4 controls. It is easy to implement one-time passwords in a way that actually works well with the user. Anomaly detection is kind of hard to do, but if you're able to detect things that are unusual in your environment, that deviate from the norm, that may actually tell you more than what the firewall rules tell you, because the firewall rule is just designed to keep somebody out. But we open up so many holes in the firewalls that people are getting in anyway, especially if we're talking about anybody that has access to the web. They just get in by exploiting something via the web. Now I have access to Workstation. That Workstation has access somewhere else, and they can just weave their way around. So let's kind of move on. So here's the model I talked about before. It may be missing some of the elements, but scoring system here, 1 through 5. 5 means it's the best, and 1 means it's the worst. I'm not going to run through all the numbers, but if I look at it, and this is just my view, you'd have a completely different view potentially, but I look at it and I see Java, when compared to OS patching, it doesn't gain me that much in terms of cost or management burden, but wow, risk reduction, tremendous value, so I may want to consider that. Passwords, your help desk, probably the #1 thing they deal with is password resets. If you have one-time passwords, there are never password resets. So if you can help your CIO reduce the cost of the help desk, the CIO will be your friend. And if a one-time password is compromised, it's not the headache that a password is when it's compromised. So you'll have access to these slides. I'm not going to linger too much on them because I have still a lot to go through. So let's talk about some different approaches we can take. Mostly, here's my methodology. Focus on the business needs, desired outcomes, and capabilities. Capabilities are the things that allow you to achieve the outcomes that you want, right? So we want certain outcomes. The business wants certain outcomes. This tells us how to get there. Then ask yourself and others a lot of questions. If you ask a lot of off-the-wall questions, it'll eventually open up your mind to a question maybe isn't so off the wall. And we've had a number of these in my day job organization. And challenge the assumptions that exist and recognize that needs, risks, and capabilities evolve over time. So when someone says, that's not how it is, or we tried to address it 5 years ago, things are not the same today as they were 5 years ago. Okay. So here's some questions you can ask. To get direction, how much risk are data owners and function owners willing to accept? Am I meeting stakeholders' expectations? From a capabilities and outcomes perspective, how quickly are we containing incidents compared to a year ago? That's probably important in your organization. If the source and destination of an attack are within our data center, do we have visibility? And if the answer is no, you may have a problem. From a risk perspective, what percentage of critical vulnerabilities in our environment are exploited in the wild before we remediate them? Do you know? Most organizations don't. That's a good, useful piece of information to know, because just because it's a 10 on CVSS and theoretically possibly exploitable doesn't mean anyone ever will actually exploit it. I'm concerned more about things that are actually being exploited in other organizations and then things that are being exploited in my organization. And here's an off-the-wall one. What if someone stole a laptop from an employee while he was using it? And I've thought about this. You have no control for that, I bet, technically, and you haven't educated your users on what to do. But believe it or not, there are actually technical controls. Proximity type devices you can actually have on your phone. I have it on my personal laptop here. If I move more than a certain number of feet away, it locks. Okay? Otherwise, they're going to have access to whatever the user that was logged in had access to. Something we don't think about until it happens is someone in your organization says, how are we going to not let that happen again? Right? Better think about these things and have the conversation before they do. So start somewhere. It doesn't really matter where you start. You just have to start somewhere. Don't spend an entire year figuring out where to start. Start with what's easiest, what has highest value. Start with the thing that the person you have lunch with is willing to address. And then be prepared by having information about what's happening in the wild. And then crawl, walk, run. Obviously, you probably heard that before, but I like to say get out of the crib. You can't even crawl until you get out of the crib. So get out of the crib and do something. Gain some experience and learn some lessons. Okay? Now, this is a little bit controversial, but some people are starting to think about this. If you think back to the Mac campaign from 2006 to 2009, they said the Macs are secure. You know what? They weren't secure, but threat actors were not looking at Macs, so therefore they were low risk. So I do agree with that. So if you can put a control in place that the threat actors either aren't aware of or don't have the resources to address, or because they're looking for opportunistic vulnerabilities versus targeting you, you may be better off than if you're using the thing that everybody else under the sun is using that they already have a kit for, that they can just click a button and address. So yeah, so do you have tools that are, have high penetration, meaning everybody else is using them? Can somebody else discover that you're using that tool pretty quickly? Do you have compensating controls? How quickly can you remediate the vulnerabilities? These are all things that you really need to take into account. And so you may want to consider some things others aren't even using, even if you decide that this technology is not tried and true. So for example, sandboxing with vendors like FireEye, well, there's already bypasses for that type of technology. That said, very few people are exploiting them. Same thing with Microsoft Emmet. It protects against a lot of zero-day vulnerabilities. It's technically possible to bypass it, but there's not really much of a need because very few people are running it. Well, run it, and when it becomes an issue because now there's ways to exploit it, move on to something else. Don't keep sticking with the things everybody has that aren't working because everybody is able to find the vulnerabilities fast and exploit them fast. So leave the echo chamber. Don't just talk to people in information security. We're smart, or a lot of us are, but you should be talking to other people. Here's a very difficult to read mind map where I talk about some of the groups and events you can participate in, where you can find more information, how you can leverage your personal and professional network, and other fields that I think are really important to get exposure to, which include psychology, behavioral economics, statistics, finance, law, and privacy. That's not comprehensive, but it's a start. So look outside the echo chamber. Security awareness. You really need to define high priority outcomes and focus on them. So for example, does your workforce know what an incident is? And do they know what to do if there is one? If the answer is no, you may want to start there from a security awareness perspective before you tell them about phishing or the latest vulnerability, because they're still not going to know it's necessarily an incident or know what to do about it, right? And make it personal and relevant. A lot of organizations don't like to do that, but I believe people don't care about your information, your systems. I mean, let's be honest, to some degree, you really don't if you were in a different role. They care to some degree, but they care about their own stuff. So if you can get them to practice good security hygiene for their own personal stuff, well, it lends some credibility to what you're trying to have them do in your workforce. And if you get them to create strong passwords or do encryption or lock their personal device, they'll carry that over just like people are used to locking the door on their personal car or a rental car. It's not their car. And that is a good way to approach information security. You have to make it relevant to them and important to them, just like every other type of risk. I'm not going to go through a threat model, but this is a general concept. It's not a threat model. It's called the cyber kill chain, but I just call it the kill chain. And what the first piece is collecting information via various sources. So if your executives are putting information on social media, or you are, or using the same passwords in other places you use for your workplace, that's information that could potentially be gathered. The more you can reduce that, the less likely it is they will have something they can leverage to get into your environment. All right, so cloud mobile. Long story short, it's coming. You can't stop it, so don't try to. So instead of saying no, why don't you take a different approach and say, how might we enable this in a way that helps the business and allows them to manage the risks? And if you think in that way, you'll find you'll have different outcomes. All right, I went through that. Looks like I have a few of the same slides. Oh, going the wrong way. Okay. All right, I want to talk about some things that are not metrics. So the average days to patch a vulnerability is not a metric. Number of people open up a communication about phishing is not a metric. Why? Because it doesn't describe outcomes, capabilities, or the direction you're going in. It doesn't really answer questions or allow you to answer questions. It's not meaningful and actionable. What is would be the percent of your critical vulnerabilities that are patched beyond a certain time threshold and the median days above that threshold, because you can actually do something with that. Then the percent responding to a phishing email broken down by whether they've actually read your targeted security awareness or not. That actually tells you whether it's effective. Okay, so there's a lot of signal and noise. we really need to separate the signal from the noise, and more noise you can get out of your environment, the more you can focus on the signal. I'm going to go through some of this quickly just so I can get to the end. Okay. Don't treat everyone equally. Some people are riskier than others in your organization for a variety of reasons. If a system is accessed by risky people, that system is more risky than if it's accessed by people that are not risky. It's not really rocket science, so if you're looking at the sensitivity of a system, A and B and their equivalent from every other perspective, but risky people are accessing this one and non-risky people are accessing this one, treat the ones that have risky people accessing them differently because they're higher risk. Okay, so think about your adversary. So this is something I found on the internet where people were able to defeat facial recognition just by taping up their faces. Looks rather disturbing, but you need to think about ways that your adversaries are actually going to try to exploit your vulnerabilities. So they don't need APTs because you haven't addressed commodity vulnerabilities and exploits. Your DMZ may not actually be a DMZ, so the thing you don't care about in the DMZ may provide access to the things you do care about. And stringing 3 CVSS 6s together may be more critical to you than a 10. And let's talk about the Chinese threat. So you have folks in your organization that do work in China, so you're concerned about it and give them loaner laptops, and that's good to do. When you bring them back, you wipe them. What you don't know is, was the hardware modified? Was the BIOS modified? Are you doing anything to address the tampering? And what? You have Lenovo laptops that were actually made in China, and Lenovo knows it was shipped to you. That's even scarier. So would it possibly be less expensive and a better decision if when they came back with the laptops, you just destroyed them? Or you sold them on eBay and took a $500 loss? Depending on what the risk is, that might be an approach that's actually a good approach to take. Password composition, if you make them long, it's less likely that an attacker is going to be successful. If you disallow certain topologies, meaning a lot of passwords begin 6 or 7 letters, first one's uppercase, followed by a number, maybe a symbol or a number and symbol. You don't allow them to use those kind of patterns, it's less likely the attacker is going to break the password. There's 110,000 characters in the Unicode character set that are encoded. I'm not saying you do this, but if you have randomly generated passwords and the user doesn't need to see them, even putting in one character from that character set is likely going to stop nearly every password attack that there is. Okay, when you measure stuff, you really need to measure stuff, and it doesn't have to be hard to do. There are a lot of things in your environment to look at. Let's jump back down to the bottom, walk your environment. You can walk around and learn things about the effectiveness of your controls, or people leaving workstations unlocked, passwords out, 2-factor authentication tokens laying about. Talk to people, ask them about the controls they have in place, ask them why they're effective or not effective, ask them what they recommend. All right, fallacy, security through obscurity. It actually does work, just don't put all your eggs in that basket. Yes, you can switch from IE. You can have multiple browsers in your organization and only use IE for the stuff that's internal. Okay, you can move from detection to prevention mode by starting small, analyzing data, establishing thresholds using statistics, going through a tabletop to demonstrate what would happen if you went in prevention mode, and then making the case and demonstrating the risk and reward and repeating that process and building credibility. All right. Only as strong as the weakest link? Yeah, not really true, because we usually have controls that are kind of layered is really the situation. So your controls are really as strong as the strongest node. If you have to go through step 1, 2, and 3 to get in, and step 2 super hard, it doesn't matter how weak step 3 is because they're never going to get to step 3 or control 3. Obviously, there are some controls you have where you have 10 sets of controls and one of them's easy to bypass, so this doesn't always apply. Best practices, there's not really such a thing. Best practices are just things that a lot of people are doing, and it's considered due care, and the concept of due care and best practice are really converging, meaning it's something you do because other people are doing it. If you don't do it, you'll look bad. So don't use the term best practice as a unicorn. There's really only what works and doesn't work. Okay, it's not our job to say something's secure. Don't ever say something's secure because stuff isn't secure. There's a spectrum. It's very, very secure, very, very low risk, and very, very high risk. Look, there's some things that we've said are secure, like full disk encryption, solid MD5s, SSL, TLS, 2-factor authentication, and TrueCrypt. Wow. But, you know, over time, over the last year, some of these things haven't been secure. Don't you feel stupid for saying they were secure? Maybe you should have said they were low risk. All right. And let's stop calling users idiots. I have 3 more slides, so I'm going to wrap up. Let's not say that users are idiots and saying that we can't fix stupid. Because if you do that, you're really basically calling yourself an idiot too. Because you don't always eat your own information security dog food. And there's other types of risk that if you talk to other subject matter experts, you're not addressing in the way they think you should. So you're being hypocritical if you call people stupid and say they can't be fixed. So don't do that anymore. And you can change behavior. You can't change it with everyone, but you have some opportunity to influence it. Big takeaways: question best practices, challenge the status quo, beware of unintended consequences, bust through broken paradigms, and think and act different. Here's some rules that I've already shared, neatly packaged together. So when you look at the slide, you have them all in one place. Same thing with guiding practices, principles. And unfortunately, I'm out of time. I'm willing to take questions and discussions, and I'm going to be here for a few more hours. So track me down if you have any questions or is anything you want to talk about. Appreciate your time.